Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's keynote webinar titled, Why We Need a More Medical Cannabis System. This webinar is part of the 6th annual event in the 2023 Cannabis Science Virtual Event Series. I am Shelley Mulock of LabRoots, and I'll be your moderator for today's event. Today's educational web seminar is presented by LabRoots. Before we begin, I would like to remind everyone that this event is interactive. We encourage you to first participate by communicating with the other attendees using our live chat feature during the presentation. You can find the live chat located at the left of your screen. You can also participate by submitting as many questions as you would like during the presentation. To do so, simply type them into the Ask a Question box and click Submit. We'll answer as many questions as we have time for at the end of the presentation. If you have trouble seeing or hearing the presentation, click on the Help Desk button located at the top of your screen within the navigation bar or from the lobby within the event. Finally, as a reminder, this presentation is educational and offers free continuing education credits. Click on the Continuing Education Credits link located in the Abstract tab from the menu at the left of your screen and follow the process to obtain your credits. Now let's get started. I'd like to introduce today's speaker, Jordan Tishler, MD. Dr. Tishler is the president and CEO of Inhale MD, the president of the Association of Cannabinoid Specialists, and an instructor of medicine at Harvard Medical School. For a complete biography on our speakers, please visit the Presenter tab from the menu on the left of your screen. Dr. Tishler, you may now begin your presentation.
Well, thank you for that lovely introduction. And thank you to everybody for coming today. We're going to talk a little bit about cannabis policy. So if you were thinking that this was going to be a talk about using cannabis for medical treatment, that's not today's topic. We're going to talk more about the regulatory framework and the things that are presenting obstacles to good medical care at this time. So next slide here is just a little bit about me. I kind of go into this, I usually say, so that people understand that I haven't completely lost all my marbles. I went to Harvard Medical School like a bajillion years ago. I trained in internal medicine at one of the Harvard hospitals. And then I went and spent the balance of my career as an emergency room physician for the VA. And you can imagine what they felt when I started to get interested in cannabinoid medicine. But it was, in fact, my experience through working at the VA that led me to this interest. As you can imagine, in the emergency room, we saw a large number of veterans whose lives were dramatically harmed and, in fact, sometimes really quite destroyed by substances. And really, on that top 10 list of substances, alcohol was number 1 through 9. And then maybe at the bottom, there was a small smattering of opioids and benzos and such like that. And in Massachusetts around 2011, when we started talking about medical cannabis as a ballot issue, I thought to myself, you know, it's interesting that I've seen so many veterans harmed by these other substances, some of which are used medically, some of which are sort of freely recreationally available, but I've never seen anybody really sick from cannabis. So if that implies something about the relative risk, maybe I should be looking into what are the potential benefits. That led me to several years of doing my homework, and I came away with from the deep dive through PubMed with the sense that cannabis was in fact a potentially beneficial medication, but that like all medications, it has risks as well as potential benefits and needs to be treated with the kind of respect that we would have for any other medication, and attention to things like dose and timing and frequency and those sorts of things. As I mentioned, I was working for the VA, and they were none too thrilled with my newfound interest. It actually went all the way up to Washington, where their chief legal counsel said, well, whatever he's doing on his own time is his business. And that led me to look around and realize that not only was the VA unable or unwilling to get into this field, but so was my home institution at the Brigham and Women's Hospital. And that led me to form my private practice in HaleMD. It was certainly never on my bucket list to run a private practice, but this became the tool by which I could take care of patients and also then turn around like I'm doing today and bring this kind of information to my colleagues. Excuse me. Shortly after that, I was looking around the world at what was going on and recognized that there were fairly few physicians operating in this area. And of those, fairly few of them still were doing it with knowledge and caring and spending the time devoted to their patients. And that led me to form the Association of Cannabinoid Specialists, which is really focused on providing education for clinicians, either those clinicians who want to practice cannabinoid medicine or those who are busy being primary care but need to know enough about this sort of thing to know where it fits in their patients' treatment plans. We also focus a lot on regulation, and of course, that's going to be the focus of our conversation today. Just to mention a couple of companies that I work with in the cannabis space, none of whom have any bearing on our discussion today. This slide, which is actually already out of date, shows the widespread acceptance of cannabis throughout the United States. You can see that the vast majority of states now are either in the light or dark green categories of either medical or both recreational and medical cannabis availability. Texas is changing. A number of these other states are in process. But it's important for us to understand that in one form or another, cannabis is available to our patients in most places throughout the country. In fact, I believe the statistic last I looked was that over 90% of Americans lived in areas where cannabis was freely available. By contrast, we need to remember that cannabis, marijuana, is a Schedule I medication lumped in with LSD, MDMA, heroin, and a bunch of other chemicals and medications which are significantly dangerous. The qualifications for Schedule I include high risk of addiction, high risk of abuse, and no accepted medical utility. Clearly, cannabis does not fall into that category, and yet it remains in Schedule I for a number of political reasons. The following slides depict a number of quotations from real patients in my practice, as illustrative of how off the mark things are at the moment. One said to me, "I don't know what your doctors talk." Well, let me preface this and say, this is the quote he gave me from the bud tender. So these are the bud tender's words. "I don't know what your doctor's talking about. Don't listen to him. I'll tell you what to do." They kept trying to get me to buy more. They have these volume deals and they push other products. And what's up with the prize wheel? This isn't The Price is Right. "He told me to add this keef stuff to my vaporizer, and now I feel sick, doctor. Why?" This was a gentleman who I had instructed to use a very small dose in his flower vaporizer to achieve a certain goal. And the very helpful bud tender suggested he add keef, which is a powdered form of high concentrate cannabis. And now we've taken his dose from based on a 15% cannabis up to like a 65%. And very clearly he got way more than either he or I had in mind. "And you were right, doctor. They immediately suggested CBD. It's a good thing you warned me about how dangerous this could be." This is actually an interesting scenario and really points out some of the problems with our dispensing system. This was a patient who came to me for routine back pain, but incidentally, he had had a liver transplant and was on tacrolimus or everolimus, which are immunosuppressants that are necessary to maintain the transplanted liver, wherein if the doses of those medications get too high, it can be lethal, and if they get too low, you can lose the organ. And CBD interacts with both of those medications, but of course the bud tender doesn't know that sort of thing. The current dispensing system is good for industry. That is to say, it's good for industry. It's not necessarily good for patients and the clinicians who serve them. The current approach is filled with misdirection, upsell tactics, false claims about, or at least unsubstantiated claims about the use of cannabis. Folks who are giving these kinds of advice and making these claims have inadequate medical knowledge, exemplified by that CBD in the liver transplant patient. And most of all, there's a significant conflict of interest, right? The person behind the counter shouldn't be giving advice. They're there to sell a lot of products. And that right there is a huge conflict of interest. These problems, as you guys know, don't really exist the same way in the pharmacy and pharmaceutical systems, because frankly speaking, the federal government has regulated what those points of sales can say and what they can't say. And that allows us to prescribe medications and be assured that patients are going to get good advice at the pharmacy and not a whole lot of upsell. A fundamental point that we have to understand is that patients are just not the same as recreational users. And right now, the industry would like to lump them all together because it's easier to sell a high volume of cannabis if we're just treating everybody as though they were recreational. But in fact, many times, in fact, most of the time, the goals of patients are really the opposite of those who are using it recreationally. For recreational users, they love the ride. This is an entertainment phenomenon. So they are interested in what new products do you have, what's exciting. Experimentation is part of the fun. Let me see what this new product does for me, or let's see if I take a really big amount of this stuff, what I will feel like. And so ultimately, there is kind of a more is better mentality in the recreational space, which in fact may become problematic as people use too much of it on a recreational level. But it is fundamentally a different point of view than what we think of for our patients. Patients, by contrast, are not interested in the ride. They're not interested in exciting. They just want to feel normal. They feel lousy because of their illness, and all they really want is to get back to themselves. The high or the intoxication is really a side effect, and oftentimes it's an unwanted side effect. I often say, if I had a nickel for every patient who says to me, "Doc, give me the kind of cannabis that won't cause any high," I'd be much wealthier. As with every medication, our focus needs to be on the minimal effective dose. We don't want more is more. We want how little of this stuff can we get away with using to achieve the necessary benefit. And of course, most of our medical patients are not simple. They have complex medical problems across multiple systems, pulmonary, cardiac, et cetera, neurologic. And oftentimes these issues interact. And certainly they are on many medications, and those may interact, and cannabis or cannabinoids may interact with that. And so we really need the complete picture in that clinical sense. And of course, at the dispensary, they don't have that, nor would they know what to do with it should they have had it. We're going through some growing pains, very clearly. And the era in cannabinoid regulation we're in at the moment really bears a striking resemblance to what's called the patent medicine era of medicine, which is a time that really dates from the end of the Civil War on up to 1934. And, you can see in the picture this sort of quaint looking bottle of medication that has all kinds of stuff in it: alcohol, cannabis, chloroform. Don't know what they were thinking chloroform was good for. Probably just a solvent, and then morphine. It's sort of good for what ails you, but of course, fully backed with these unsubstantiated claims, either at the level of the seller or the manufacturer. There was no understanding of or attempt of quality control. So products varied from bottle to bottle, as well as from manufacturer to manufacturer. And there was a high degree of contamination in these products, which were completely untested. And most importantly, there was no proven efficacy. So there was all sorts of what we would call snake oil being sold. The federal government finally got around to saying enough is enough in 1934, and they passed the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act of that year, and this was the inception of the FDA. It was established to make safety regulations, to standardize dose measurements, to define a prescription, which is a hugely enormously important vehicle that specifies the medication, the route by which it should be taken, the dose, the frequency, and also, very importantly, the sales amount. These are things that prior to getting into the cannabis space, I had written thousands upon thousands of prescriptions and never really given much thought to why we do it and why it has these key parts to it. But it's become patently obvious to me in the cannabis arena, since they're missing, that we in fact really need them. The FDA establishes sales limits so that the patient gets a reasonable amount of a medication and not sort of an unlimited supply of potentially dangerous stuff. And it addresses that issue around conflict of interest by limiting what both the manufacturers and the sellers can say about a product. So where are we now? Well, the FDA has been in a very uncomfortable position, I believe, for the last 5+ years, in which they found in many ways that their hands are tied. It's been demanded of them, particularly by Congress, that they regulate cannabis and cannabinoids, but they haven't got the data that they need in order to make reasonable and thoughtful regulations. And worse than that, with all of the bills and demands made by Congress, there have been no new allocations of funding in order to accomplish this work. And so the FDA has made it very clear that they're working on this. And furthermore, that whenever they take on the regulation of new substances like CBD and cannabinoids more generally, that they're stealing budget from their own budget in food safety. So they're loath to reappropriate that medication away from the safety of our food chain, simply because there are other things that need to be regulated. Now, interestingly enough, in January of this year, the FDA finally came out with a pair of statements that were very helpful, I think, in the cannabis industry. The first statement was the statement that they expected cannabinoid medications would not be regulated as supplements or dietary agents and would be regulated as drugs. And they prepared a very concise description of the process and the forms necessary for companies to pursue that kind of regulatory pathway, on the understanding that many of the people who are in the cannabis industry don't come from the pharmaceutical industry and wouldn't necessarily have that background. So I think that was helpful. And then in the second bulletin, they made it very clear that CBD is a regulated drug, and that they would not be regulating that as a dietary supplement or a food additive based on the data that they had. And that was a huge step forward, I think, as well. We have to look at all of this in the context of something that I call the nutraceutical lie. In 1994, a law was passed called the Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act. And essentially, it took away from the FDA regulation of supplements, other than to maintain the need for some basic manufacturing processes and the continued post-market monitoring. So essentially, what this did was it said that companies could market dietary supplements without proving safety or efficacy, and that the FDA would simply monitor to see if problems arose. And we've certainly seen over the years problems arise. This really empowered an industry that's based on a lot of hype and falsehoods because they have no need to prove safety or efficacy. This has turned into a $164 billion a year industry. That number is a couple years old, it's probably much bigger now. And just for reference, the United States Preventive Services Task Force, which is a group supported by the federal government, has done reviews, repeated reviews of the science around supplementation, and shows no value and occasionally shows harm associated with the supplements in patients who do not have demonstrated specific nutrient deficiencies. This is the model that has been touted for cannabis products and marketing. I think it's very clearly not in the best interests of patients, and again was rejected by the FDA in January this year. But of course, Congress continues to put forward bills that would force Congress to force the FDA to take a different non-science-based approach to this. What do we know about cannabis? Well, one of the things we know is that THC is the main medicine. It really annoys me when you see any lay article in the press and they mention THC, the next parenthetic paragraph is the part that gets you high. Well, that isn't wrong, but it really puts the focus on the side effects rather than the main effects. And in fact, we've had over 70 years of high quality research on THC in the context of cannabis, and really has shown that this is the primary effective agent for a range of issues, and from pain to nausea and vomiting to anxiety and beyond. There is a lot of discussion, again, at the lay level about different strains or cultivars of cannabis. You'll note that there are well over 7,000 of these different types, and that they come with lots of sort of colorful names like Orange Crush and Afghan Purple and whatever. The industry has a very significant interest in maintaining the idea that these strains have different effects and different medical benefits, because that keeps the patient sort of on this quest for the holy grail, if you will. Well, this one worked, but it wasn't perfect. Okay, try this one, try that one, keep buying, keep buying, keep buying. When it comes down to it in the medical literature, we've never been able to show any significant differences in medical outcomes based on these different strains, and that most of these strains are in fact compositionally very similar. There have been a number of attempts to develop rubrics by which we could find and describe meaningful chemical composition differences, but the most recent and complete one was broke these strains down into 9 different categories, which were in fact local to Southern California, so may not have been generalizable elsewhere. But really, when you start talking about 9 categories, it's unclear whether this is too complicated for use in the real world. CBD is another area where there's a whole lot of hype. There's a lot of very interesting preclinical research going on showing potentially value as an anti-nociceptic, as an anti-inflammatory, as a neuroprotectant. But the reality here is that almost none of this has been replicated in human beings. There is really very strong evidence that CBD is effective either as a mono agent or in combination with other conventional anti-epileptic drugs in children who have Dravet's or Lennox-Gastaut syndrome, which are rare genetic seizure disorders. But when we start to talk about CBD for people who have other sorts of seizures, or we start to talk about anxiety, pain, and insomnia, really the evidence in human beings just isn't there. There are, as you guys are probably aware, a whole bunch of other cannabinoids and a whole other class of agents called terpenoids, and these are thought to perhaps contribute to the differences between strains to the extent that we can find them. And there's a whole lot of really interesting research going on in that field, but none of it is ready for prime time in human beings. On the topic of CBD and THC and drug interactions, These charts, I think, are somewhat helpful. On the left, you'll see a large group of medications that patients were found to be Googling. And as we look through these charts, what we really want to look for are the red Ys. This means that there is an interaction that we can find in the real world. And if you look on this left chart, you'll see that there is an interaction between CBD and esomeprazole. But thankfully, esomeprazole is pretty benign, so that elevated levels of it are not particularly harmful. You'll also notice that there are some black teas. These are chemical interactions which are theoretically possible, but so far we haven't seen them in the real world. On the right, on the other hand, is the list of medications that I was particularly concerned about. And as you can see, there are a whole lot more red Ys in this column, particularly in the CBD column. Amiodarone is a complex cardiac medication that is potentially lethal if misused. Everolimus and tacrolimus, I mentioned before, are strong immunosuppressant medications that, again, can be lethal if misused. Warfarin is a blood thinner. Obviously, we don't want that to get out of hand. And the one that I like to point out to everybody, because I think it is really kind of a disaster in the making, is loratadine, right, which is good old Claritin. And this is available over the counter, as is unfortunately a lot of CBD. And what we need to know is that when you elevate the level of loratadine, it can actually cause potentially fatal cardiac arrhythmias. And so I think that this is really just a disaster in the making. Currently, there are a number of bills in the various houses of Congress, and people are very excited about this idea that we might change federal legislation. And I think that that's a good point, but we have to look a little bit at what is being proposed. And so in the House, there is the Marijuana Opportunity Reinvestment and Expungement, or MORE Act. This has been passed by the House 3 times already, but never taken up in the Senate. And in part, that's because its focus is solely on business and on racial justice issues, but there's no mention of patient care, not that that's preventing the Senate. But really the point is that there's no actual regulatory framework built into that bill, so that it is really more of a bill that is aimed at galvanizing support and looking good for the electorate, but it isn't really a bill that, if passed, is going to present a path forward. More recently, there was the Cannabis Administration and Opportunity Act introduced by Senator Schumer. This is relatively similar to the MORE Act in that it is extraordinarily business friendly. Even after revision, it's very heavy on taxation and probably therefore is untenable as it is written. It spends quite a bit of time focused on racial justice, but it really, again, doesn't provide anything for medical patients. It sort of loosely assigns medical care to the FDA. They get an entire paragraph devoted to this in a 400-page document. But the point is there's no framework, and most importantly, they assign no financial allocation to the FDA to do this important regulatory work. It's very clear that in the discussion of these bills, there is really no focus on healthcare, and I would contend that healthcare is a social justice issue and needs to be addressed on a national level. So what should this federal system provide? Well, first of all, it needs to provide the requirement for exact prescriptions. It needs to make sure that we clinicians are expert enough that we can write such a prescription and that we can take responsibility for the outcome like we do with every other medication. Furthermore, it needs to be honored, meaning that if we write the prescription, that's what the patient gets and only that, and there's no upselling, no arm twisting, and that sort of thing. Similarly, we need a moratorium on medical claims, both in medical dispensaries and perhaps even more importantly in recreational stores. to prevent patients from getting bad advice and prevent that advice from inuring to the bottom line of that establishment. We also need interstate operability. Many of my patients here in the Northeast are snowbirds. They need to be able to go to Florida with their medication without fear of being arrested. They need to be able to get refills in Florida while they're down there. That's sort of very basic stuff that we take for granted with other medications. We need common safety standards. You may not know it, but there are different safety standards in many different states. Until recently, Arizona, for example, had no no testing for safety or potency for medical cannabis. Similarly, for a long time, Colorado had no testing on medical, but very stringent testing on recreational, having to do with the order in which these things were regulated. And actually, in Maine, there's still no requirement for testing on the medical side, whereas there is on the recreational side. So we need something that is both stringent and applied across the board. We need to get away from lists of conditions. The perfect example of this is that almost every state has glaucoma on the list, and we know that cannabinoids can, in fact, or THC specifically, can lower intraocular pressure, but it's only really for 2 hours, and which means that somebody would need to redose every couple hours, even through the night while they're supposed to be asleep. And this really makes it a very ineffective medication. It's not safe as compared with conventional medications where you put a couple of drops in twice a day and that's the end of the discussion. Similarly, there are states that don't have pain as an option. And, this is one of the areas where we actually know that cannabis is particularly viable. We need to get away from these lists. We need to have educated, responsible clinicians making these decisions and then taking responsibility for them. In Massachusetts, and I think this is unique amongst the states at the moment, when a patient purchases their cannabis, I can look those purchases up in a HIPAA-protected database, just like the PDMP that we use for other medications. And this, of course, is helpful to me in being able to monitor what people are getting, how they're using it, how much, and to start an ongoing conversation with the patient aimed at making sure that they're using this in the most beneficial and most safe fashion. We need to acknowledge that recreational use exists, and we need to figure out ways in which to provide systems for sale for recreational purposes that do not subvert our medical patients, and also provide appropriate medical understanding of the risks associated with recreational use. And then, of course, any federal legislation really should allocate money for ongoing research so that we can answer the many, many questions that remain. At the beginning of the talk, I mentioned the Association of Cannabinoid Specialists. We are an international organization of healthcare professionals who are really focused on cannabinoid medicine and in particular human data-driven treatments and providing thorough ongoing care and guidance to our patients. We focus on advocacy to state and federal governments, education, as I mentioned, to people who want to become specialists, as well as to frontline workers. We provide education and mentoring, and then we have all kinds of online events, both live and pre-recorded. So if you have any interest in this field, please visit us at cannaspecialist.org to learn more, and you can also reach out to me. Here is my last slide. This is my practice, Inhale MD. You may find it useful to visit my practice website. We have over 200 articles on various topics related to patient care with cannabinoids that are written for patients, and you may find that those are helpful to you. That's inhalemd.com. You can reach out to me day or night at doc@inhale.com and inhalemd.com, I should say. And I'd be most appreciative of the questions and happy to help. So that's pretty much the end of my chat, and I'm eager to hear what questions this may have brought up for you all.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Tishler, for your informative presentation. We will now start the Q&A portion of the webinar. If you have a question you'd like to ask, please do so now. Just click on the Ask a Question box located on the far left of your screen. So let's get started. Okay, Dr. Tishler, the first question is, if you're saying that strains aren't relevant and CBD is unproven, why do so many people swear by them?
You know, that's a really good question. And I think that the answer to that is that there's an incredibly high placebo effect involved. Many of these medications present some level of alteration in the sensorium that people come to expect. But there's also just a whole lot of belief involved. And I'll give you an example. About a year ago, I was involved in a clinical trial. It was a randomized control trial of CBD for anxiety. It was given in a blinded fashion over several weeks with escalating dose. And at the end of this, and it had a reasonable number of subjects in both the control and experimental arms, about 110 in each. And so at the end of this, the analysis showed us that 71% of the participants got benefit from the placebo and no more got benefit from the CBD. So two conclusions. One, that CBD wasn't more effective than placebo, obviously, but also that a 71% placebo rate is enormous compared to the placebo rate that we see in other trials. And the explanation, as I see it, is that while nobody knew which arm they were in, they all knew that it was a CBD for anxiety trial. And so that alone created a belief that they were going to be getting something that was going to help them. And hence we see such a large placebo effect.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, thank you. Okay, so our next question is, I noticed that you say medical or recreational use, but not adult use. And why is that?
You know, there's so much political manipulation in this field that's one of those where I'm resisting. I think that the term adult use is really at its best trying to differentiate adults from children, and that's I think a legitimate concept. But on a more insidious level, it's really suggesting, again, that recreational and medical users can kind of be lumped into this one category of things adults might do to help themselves kind of thing. But the net effect is it's really promoting this idea of do-it-yourself healthcare. And I think that is a mistake. I think it is a mistake because of all the conflict of interest, and also because the depth of knowledge necessary to really understand and help patients with these medications is vast, and it's just not something that people learn overnight, or that they learn necessarily from their own personal experience, as we might think, the bud tenders. So I think that adult use has really come to be kind of this catch-all term that undermines the importance and perhaps the sanctity of medical care.
All right, that's very helpful. Thank you for that. Okay, so the next question that is out there for you is, where do you see the medical and recreational industries going in the future, to that point?
Yeah, well, I think that ties very much into the previous question, which is that I think that the industry would like to get all of the medical personnel out of the equation. It seems that they're doing everything they can to point people either to completely DIY their healthcare through the recreational systems, or perhaps to get a card from a card mill where they get a card that allows them to buy more or cheaper or whatever, but they're not getting any guidance or advice from a clinician. And the sad reality is that this is not helping our patients, but it's even worse than that, because I think that what we know is that there is a certain segment of the US population that is using cannabis or willing to use cannabis in some form, and that there is a small group of people who are using it medically, who are adopting it for that purpose. But as a percentage of the population, that's a very tiny group. And then there's everybody else. And so if you say, well, look, there are roughly 20 million American cannabis users, presumably largely recreationally, and then you say, but in the 55-year-old and older crowd, there are 180 million Americans, you can see that there's a vast group out there that isn't entertaining the notion of cannabis as a medicine. And we know that every single one of them will, over the remainder of their lifetime, develop something that we could help with cannabis, whether it's arthritis or cancer or end of life anxiety. I mean, everybody goes through this. It's part of the human condition. And so to the extent that our current system is sort of loosey-goosey enough that it isn't actually impinging upon the world of sort of mainstream Americans and the mainstream clinicians who take care of them, then I think we're really missing the mark. So to the extent that the industry keeps pushing in this recreational way, we're not going to serve the much larger group of people. And at the end of it, I think what we're going to end up is seeing the medical market completely dry up, and either people will go and buy products on the recreational market with or without some guidance, or we'll develop pharmaceuticals and then it will be sort of regulated through the standard FDA pathways. I don't really have a problem with the latter option, but I hope that we don't end up in a scenario where patients cannot get medical cannabis before the pharmaceuticals come around. So that could be an awkward inflection.
Right. Yes. Okay. All right. Our next question is, the FDA finally made 2 statements about cannabinoids in January of 2023. What do you think about those?
Well, I think I probably belabored this point already in the talk, but I think generally speaking that they made some good decisions. Number one, it's hard for them to backtrack and regulate CBD as a dietary supplement or food additive when in fact there's already an approved drug in Epidiolex, right? That actually violates federal law. But I think more broadly, they've taken a look at the safety profile of CBD and THC, and they've said, look, there's enough risk here. For example, the slides I showed you all on the drug interactions, that putting this in your latte is probably not a good idea, especially if there are especially if there's a chance that it could end up in somebody's latte without their being aware of it. So, for example, you go down to your Starbucks and you order a strawberry refresher, which is some kind of weird drink that my daughter used to like. And it's a mixture of God only knows what, and it's pink and it has some dehydrated sort of vaguely strawberry-ish looking stuff in it. But the reality here is I don't know what the heck they've put in there. And I'm essentially assuming that the FDA has made sure that all of the stuff that go into the cup isn't going to kill me, right? So if CBD were a dietary additive, I could go in and order something by name and not realize that buried in the list of ingredients along with spirulina and, wheatgrass and whatever was CBD. And then that could start to interact with the medications that I'm taking. So I think that, having a substance like CBD or other cannabinoids that are clearly biologically active, regulated as though they kind of weren't, as though they were just sort of broccoli or something. And we could argue about, broccoli is biologically active too, but and the evidence for that is it interferes with warfarin. But more interesting that there are issues, and because these are compounds that are novel to regulation and novel to the populace, unlike broccoli, these require more study and more control. So I think that they've really hit the nail on the head by saying, essentially standing up to this industry and their various lobbies and saying, yeah, I know you want to just be able to sell this all the time and put it wherever you want in food or whatever. But no, these are potentially dangerous medical components. And as such, we're going to require that you start to prove their efficacy, start to prove their safety, start to prove your manufacturing, so that these then are in fact prescribable medications.
Yeah. Oh, that's very helpful. Thank you so much again. It looks like we have time for one more question today. So our last question is, my understanding of different strains has more to do with the terpene, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, profile, and the effects of the different terpenes on the overall effect of the cannabis used. It has been shown that terpenes can affect the cannabis experience. Do you agree with this or not? And can you explain?
Sure, that's a great and complicated question, and let's see if I can tease it apart a little bit. Certainly a lot has been said and written about terpenes and their effect either on the user experience and or sort of on the efficacy of that kind of cannabis for medical purposes. It's kind of hard for us to address the issue of the user's experience. First of all, we don't have any good studies that look at sort of differing terpenes in a blinded fashion. I'm always quick to point out that nobody buys cannabis without knowing something about it. You know, you go down to the dispensary and somebody says, do you want a sativa or an indica strain? Well, already those are meaningless terms, but they're used to differentiate different types into categories that imply differences in the experience and or the medical outcome. And when we take samples of things that are supposed to be indica and things that are supposed to be sativa and do chemical analysis, there's no discernible or reproducible difference between these things. That is to say, some strains may have a little bit more of this, a little bit more of that, but there's no consistency amongst those classes. There's been a whole lot of research into the various terpenes and their utility as biological agents, and in particular in the medical context, but none of those have reached an evidentiary level in human beings that makes it clear what to do with them. And it's certainly more unclear how the terpenes interact with or interplay with cannabinoids or with each other. So I think that the idea that these terpenes influence user experience, maybe that's true, or maybe that's a bias that's instilled by the discussion at the dispensary or with the friends or whatever. On a medical level, we have not gotten to the point where we can demonstrate that there are differences between these strains in terms of medical outcomes, and also that those terpenes are responsible for those differences. They could be, but they are also very prevalent from one strain to the next. So to imply or to assume that there are differences in the medical outcomes and that that's related to those terpenes, I think we're just not there yet. It doesn't mean it isn't true. It just means we haven't been able to show it yet.
Gotcha. Very, very helpful. And thank you, Dr. Tishler, so much. Do you have any final comments for our audience today?
Thank you guys for coming and listening. I'm more than happy to be available to you guys as a resource. So you can always email me at my clinic, doc@inhalemd.com, or if you want to reach me through the Association of Cannabinoid Specialists, then that's president@cannaspecialist.org. You can go to cannaspecialist.org and read more about us. Reach out to me through that website. I'm here and freely available and eager to help in your exploration of cannabis and cannabinoid medicine.
Perfect. Thank you again, Dr. Tishler, for your time today and important research. Before we go, I'd like to thank the audience as well for joining us today and for their interesting questions. Questions we did not have time for today and those submitted during the on-demand period will be addressed by the speaker via the contact information that you provided at the time of registration. This webcast can be viewed on demand for 2 years until April 20th, 2025. LabReads will alert you via email when it's available for replay. We encourage you to share that email with your colleagues who may have missed today's live event. So until next time, thank you and goodbye.